Thank you, Jasper, and thanks for inviting me to come to speak today. So, as Jasper said, I'll leave it to the researchers to talk about the exciting projects, and I'll kind of give a high-level overview of digital humanities, kind of what are the identifying characteristics of digital humanities, particularly a focus on method, which I think is one of the things that makes it possibly identifiable or different from, for want of a better term, the traditional humanities, and also looking at how that maybe affects or relates to the area of open science. I'll also briefly look at roles of libraries and publishers. I'll be more speaking obviously from a library perspective, but I think some of the challenges and opportunities are relatable. And then I'll sum up by looking at some of the challenges overall and maybe how this can go forward. So to begin with the million-dollar question, what is the digital humanities, or what are the digital humanities? And I think sometimes it's not a super productive question to start with. It's there's been a lot of back and forth within the field, and this is a website, whatisdigitalhumanities.com, where when each time you refresh the website, it generates a new definition, and I think there are over 800 in the database, which kind of speaks to how difficult it's been to pin down as an area. So sometimes it's easier to, this is kind of a definition that I've kind of settled on, and I think the important word for me is the critical use. So it's not just putting digital methods with humanities research for the sake of it, it's for enhancing and improving humanities research, and also that there's a critical element in questioning and assessing the outputs and the methods themselves, the processes that are used. So I think bringing that humanistic inquiry to the digital field, it's a two-way street, I suppose. So as I say, the three researchers will be looking at very exciting projects. I just quickly wanted to, sometimes it's easier to look at examples in the field as a way of defining it or explaining it. And because we're in London today, I picked out one that it's not a very academic example. I suppose it's from the Londonist online magazine, but they looked at Charles Dickens and the locations in his novels and mapped it using Google Maps and pulled out created layers for each novel and looked at the kind of patterns of which places he was representing in his novels, and there's kind of interesting conclusions you can come to. But I suppose if you have a free hour today, you could do a walking tour of Hard Times, or if you're staying for the weekend, you could do David Copperfield. But it's kind of not super serious, but I think it does give a quick example of the kind of way that digital humanities tries to take a fresh approach to old materials or old questions. So then to zoom out for a minute, I suppose, again, just working towards a definition. Sometimes, for better or worse, digital humanities is defined by its projects, and there are some issues with that, but it is helpful to give an idea of what it is we're talking about when we talk about digital humanities. So this is by no means comprehensive, but it does, I think, give a sense, and I think it's a fluid area, so by its nature, this is constantly developing and changing. But these would be some typical project types and some typical approaches that we would see digital humanities researchers coming to the library with. And I think sometimes for researchers this can be useful to see what kind of bucket or category their own work fits into, and often it's a combination of one or more, or of two or more, but yeah, so I think it's just another way of looking at the field and trying to give a sense of what's out there. So I think to zoom out further again, common to all of those project types, there would be kind of an identifiable model that these researchers are taking sources or materials, doing something with it, and then creating some kind of output with it. So that could probably be said of most research, I suppose, but I think for digital humanities, what makes it identifiable is that there is a particular emphasis and valuing of the process, of the methods that are used, of the approaches that are undertaken, whereas maybe in traditional humanities the focus has been on the journal article and the traditional output. In digital humanities, the methods and the processes are valued as well and are kind of assessed in terms of their worth. So this is just a resource that we use in the library for teaching digital humanities to staff and students, but again just highlights these processes and the kind of the methods that are used, whether it's a coding language or a theoretical approach to modeling data or databases, but it's just it's just that identifiable characteristic of the focus on the process. So Miriam Posner, a digital humanities librarian from UCLA, has a module called How Did They Make That? And again, it's just about looking under the bonnet of a project, and she uses it with her students for understanding projects, but again also for assessing them. And as I say, this is what I think is central to DH and makes it kind of identifiable. Sometimes it's not helpful to see it as separate from humanities, and over time I think the precursor might disappear, but for today I think it's interesting or it's relevant to publishing and to open science to look at these outputs and the different types of outputs. So just looking at open science then, so we have our definition and we have our kind of areas that open science encompasses, and to me there's a correlation there between open science and digital humanities, that it is taking a wider approach of what the outputs are, what the things are that we need to preserve and share and make accessible to other researchers and to the community. So as I say, I think possibly in humanities, I think in a previous life in my library career, I was advocating institutional repositories within a humanities-based institution, and that was challenging. It was kind of fresh to that culture, and maybe just not as understood as it is in the hard sciences. But I think digital humanities could be an easier match for open science, and leads to us kind of rethinking what the outputs are. So just returning to the project model, I think these processes are outputs in themselves. They're byproducts, but they're also, whether it's data or a tool or something that is reusable for the research community. So just to briefly look at digital humanities and libraries, I think one of the things that grew out of was that there was kind of an overlap with library skills and services and what digital humanities projects and scholars were looking for. Things like metadata and content management and data structuring. These were things that at a ground level, I suppose, faculty were coming to the library looking for. And also there was the fact that libraries have curated and digitized collections themselves, and in some ways these became the raw materials then of digital humanities research. I think researchers now are kind of almost overlapping with the library role of creating collections. They are creating their own data and their own outputs from their projects. So there's kind of, and then libraries are also looking at how do we preserve, or do we preserve the outputs of these projects? So things like data collections, annotated digital objects. I think these are things that kind of are at the next generation of this link with digital humanities and libraries. How do we preserve the use of these digital collections? One thing that libraries are really pushing for at the moment is collaboration and partnership, rather than being brought in at the end of these projects, to kind of be involved early on and be involved with project planning and issues around digital preservation. And I think we've used the library as space to kind of invite researchers in. I think often, definitely in Ireland, it's typical that researchers would be kind of disparate, maybe not working necessarily with people in their own faculty, but working across different schools, and sometimes the institutional structures are not overly conducive to kind of letting these conversations happen. So sometimes library is useful as a neutral space where this can happen. And then for libraries, I think a challenge is, and a focus area is content access routes. So clearly things like APIs, I think Europeana is a good example of an aggregator where they have been able to look at giving researchers the content in a way that is usable for them. So, and for us, that's kind of the next big challenge, or just kind of a constant challenge, I suppose, as researchers keep coming up with new methods. Libraries are having to look at how they can make the content available in a useful way. Just to point to a couple of initiatives, Collections as Data in the US and Cultural Heritage Data Reuse Charter from Daria. They're kind of advocacy and working on advocacy and best practice in the area. So myself, I'm involved with the LIBER working group of libraries and digital humanities, looking at libraries and digital humanities and what are the areas that we can focus on and develop best practice in, and I'm leading a group looking at cooperation with the research community. So, but just to look at publishing and digital humanities, it's kind of similar. It's an experimental area in some ways, but this is just a list of some digital humanities journals, and quite a lot of them are kind of traditional journals in that they are still publishing articles about the project, so that they're essentially the output is kind of, the project is kind of an add-on, and the article is traditional in that sense. But there are some, I think it's a growth area where we are looking at the project as the output, or different types of output that I was talking about earlier. So the Journal of Cultural Analytics has recently developed a section introducing or looking for submissions of data sets, and I'm not sure if that's readable, but it's the second paragraph, I think, has some great questions around that it kind of speak to that critical side of digital humanities, that this is valid humanities work, but it's just a new type of output and a new type of publication. Thresholds is quite I suppose, a bespoke example where the publisher works quite closely, or the editors work quite closely with researchers to present the finished essay alongside the sources and I think they call it a patchwork tapestry. But it's a very visual and interactive site, and again, it's just looking at redefining what an article is, or what's useful for people to see in terms of the research process. And then I think a larger scale example is Stanford University Press, which have a digital projects initiative, and I think that's a really interesting example of where, again, it's the publishers collaborating with the authors, but at this point they are bringing in formal aspects like peer review and technical review, and trying to enable scholars by accrediting these projects in and of themselves, rather than trying to have a published article as an add-on. Another really good aspect of this, I think, as a librarian, is that Stanford University libraries are heavily involved, and again, from an early stage, to look at digital preservation aspects and how these projects can be preserved. Sometimes I think not all these projects need to be preserved, but it does, I think, add value and add their acceptance within the humanities community that they are, so if they can be. So just to finish with some general challenges and opportunities, I suppose. I think by nature, and we'll see from the three projects coming up, TH is quite experimental. There's not really one way of doing it or one expected outcome, and it can be challenging within the library. It can be challenging in terms of measures of success or resourcing in a meaningful way. But I think also for publishing, I think if it is something that publishers are to be involved in, I think it's kind of, again, there are different measures of success and different expectations around what the outcomes are. I think by nature it's collaborative, and I think there is a blurring of roles and a crossing of lines, I suppose. I think, as I mentioned, the researcher as library in terms of creating collections. Also, the researcher is often the publisher themselves, that they may not need a publisher, they may not need the library as well. I think there's a branch of it that I tend to call computational-led digital humanities, and I don't tend to have much to help them with in my own university, so they're completely self-sufficient. But yeah, it's just, I think at times it's collaborative, but collaboration can be time-consuming, and I don't think it shortens the length of these projects. I think there is an uncomfortable aspect to collaboration when it's across different communities, like library, researcher, and publisher, and I think it's good to be prepared for those things. As I mentioned, there are new outputs, and I think from a library point of view, we tend to push for standards, and I think standards around metadata or around structuring of data are a method of collaboration in and of themselves. I think to make your work reusable and open in a meaningful way will help the field develop and will help these projects have a long shelf life. And then I suppose in a wider sense, I think for publishing, I would see a role in being part of an infrastructure for digital humanities. As I say, the Stanford example of peer review, whether that's post-publication or during the project where they bring in technical reviewers, but I think there are institutional challenges for humanities scholars working in this field, and I think publishers have a role to help there in terms of giving these projects accreditation or credibility, and kind of, I think it assists in that kind of crucial sense of the critical inquiry of humanistic research. So yeah, that's all I kind of had to say. I was really just trying to give a broad overview, as I say, and set it up for our three researchers who will be much more exciting than I was. So thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks so much.